What's up, guys? Buckle your seatbelts, cause we are going on a hunt of a lifetime. But not just any hunt, a king hunt. But king hunts are so common in chess, right? So not just any king hunt, the most brutal king hunt of all time in the entire chess history of over 1500 years. I am Aaryaveer Kochhar, a 12-year-old chess enthusiast. Welcome to my channel, The Chess Microscope. You can also find me with the username Aaryaveer964. I will teach you everything I can, from openings to famous middle games and tactics, and to famous end games as well, and also studies which are created by the most famous chess players of all time. And to stay true to my channel's name, I will put a microscope on each and every position you could ever imagine in your life, and I will analyze it very deeply just for you guys to get much better at chess. Out of respect for Mr. Edward Lasker, I would like to kick off this channel with his amazing game against Sir George Alan Thomas. This game was played on October 29, 1912. And is still regarded as one of the most famous games ever played even today, which is around 114 years later in the future. And with that all being said, let us see this game, Edward Lasker versus Sir George Alan Thomas. Let the games begin. The game started with the queen's pawn on to d4. Now there are lots of responses to pawn to d4. I personally go for the Indian game with knight to f6. There are other responses as well, such as d5, which is the queen's pawn opening, the standard queen's pawn opening, and f5, which is the Dutch defense. But instead of all that, Sir George Alan Thomas plays pawn to e6, kind of a delayed Dutch defense, because you anyway play e6 in the Dutch defense. But Thomas actually wanted to play e6 and play f5. And again, I'm not saying that's bad. That's totally okay. It's just a delayed Dutch. But there is one problem. If you play e6 and then want to go for the Dutch, you have to learn the French defense if white plays pawn to e4. And how to respond to that. Like pawn to e4, pawn to d5, knight to c3. And then after all this, knight to f6. You have to learn all of this. If you play e6 before you played f5, and if you want to play the delayed Dutch. But Edward Lasker played knight to f3. That's also a theoretical move. Again, it's a book move. And now the delayed Dutch starts with pawn to f5. The idea of pawn to f5 is to let the queen to come to e8 and then g6. That is the entire idea of the Dutch. Because after you get all your pieces out, you castle, and then when you castle, you leave behind e8. So your queen goes to e8 and g6, and you try for an attack against the white king on the king side. That's the point of the Dutch defense. To open up the e8 to h5 diagonal for the black queen to come to g6. And now white plays knight to c3 with the idea of breaking open the center with pawn to e4. This is not theoretical move, but it is theoretical, okay? Because Stockfish sometimes does not see this is theoretical, but this is theoretical. Knight to f6, which stops pawn to e4 pawn break. And now there are lots of moves you can do in this position. You can do bishop f4, you can do e3, you can do bishop g5, which is actually what Edward Lasker actually played in his game. Bishop to g5. This is also theoretical. I will tell you where the theoretical move stops. Because right now Stockfish is not understanding where the theory stops. Bishop to g5 pins the knight to the queen. So now white can play pawn to e4. since after pawn takes, knight takes, the knight cannot capture back. And this time, black can actually go for a stone wall with pawn to d5. But Thomas played bishop e7, which is kind of an inaccuracy, and I kind of get it. Bishop b4 could have been better, or I said d5. Both of them would have been good. But bishop e7, it actually allows e4 after bishop f6, and pawn to e4. But black gets the bishop pair. So after bishop takes f6, and pawn to e4, which happened in the game, fe4, knight e4. And pawn to b6 was played for fianchettoing the bishop on b7 and targeting the diagonal where all of the white pieces are. And when castling, of course, this is the whole point of the Dutch, because after a castle, then queen e8, queen g6, and g2 is eventually weakened in the future. This is a long-term weakness, g2. Aaryaveer Kochhar played knight to e5 with the idea of queen h5 check. And here the theory stops. Now it's just a free game. The opening has not stopped yet, but the theory of the opening has stopped. And now both the players are playing freely. Knight to e5 has the idea of queen to h5 check. And then after g6, you have like kind of a kingside attack after all of this. Knight takes g6, a takes g6, and then queen takes g6 check. And then after king f8, there is knight f6, or after king e7, there's queen f6. And then white will be winning. But there are lots of solutions here for black to stop this idea. One of them is bishop takes e5, just to remove the knight completely. Another one of them is castling, and that does not queen h5 does not come with check, as the king is not on e8 anymore. And that's what Thomas realized, and he castled. Now Aaryaveer Kochhar actually played bishop d3, and I do not like this move because of bishop takes e5. After pawn takes e5, this pawn actually becomes a weakness. You might say, Aaryaveer, why is this pawn a weakness? Well, because there are not many ways to defend this pawn. Because say after knight c6 and then queen h5, there's rook f5. And now you are forking the queen and the pawn. And now black is totally better after all of this. Queen g5 is not a good move. But even after a move like queen to e2, knight takes e5 is just totally better for black. It's like practically lost for white at this point. And now black is the one who has the initiative with queen f8, some kinds of attacks here. Or they could even continue with the idea of the Dutch defense. Black will eventually develop the bishop to the b7 square and eye at the pawn on g2. And yeah, that's why white has practically lost this game. But Sir George Allen Thomas misses that and plays bishop to b7, which is obviously a miss, according to me on the computer. And probably even after he saw this game, he probably think it was a miss after like what bishop takes e5 does to white and loses the e pawn. Here white plays queen to h5, which is an inaccuracy because black can actually still play bishop takes e5 here. And after pawn takes e5, guess what? There's rook f5, and it's a fork. Same thing, but instead the knight is not developed, and the rook has to take on e5 instead of the knight. So it's slightly worse for black in this position than in last position where he played bishop takes e5 before bishop b7. These both are basically the same position, but yes, taking with the knight is better. That is why black has minus 0.7 instead of minus 1.4. Aaryaveer Kochhar would obviously have been in trouble for this. But after queen to h5, Sir George Allen Thomas again misses the move. Wait, what? Why is it mate in 7? Excuse me? What? I don't understand why. I mean, of course you had to play bishop takes c5, right? I mean, the threat of white was knight f6, and then gf6, and then queen h7, right? Or rook f6, queen f6, right? Queen h7. Right, and then white would win, right? So, after queen e7, Edward Lasker does not actually play this. Why? Because if you do this, most people will think it's already lost for black, but there is one very important move for black which still holds on in this position. It is still better for white, but black can hold on to this game, not with rook takes f6 because there's still this, and then queen h8 is made because the knight is covering this, but instead g takes f6. And guess what this move does? The queen now defends the h7 pawn. And now queen takes h7 is just simply a blunder. Because after takes, black just won a bishop for just a pawn. And now black is just totally winning. And Thomas, well, this was the whole point of his move queen to a7. He literally thought there was no way that he would lose this game, right? Well, he was wrong. Because Edward Lasker is not like most chess players. He is one of the greatest of all time, and that is where this game's name is Fatal Attraction. Get ready for this king hunt right now. Edward Lasker plays queen takes h7 check. The brilliant move of this game. A queen sacrifice. And now you may say, Aaryaveer, what is this? I mean, you can just take, right? And now you have like, there is no way to make the king, right? Well, you're wrong. The computer says mate in 6. And Edward Lasker found checkmate in 7 moves, though. Not mate in 6, actually. Checkmate in 7. Edward Lasker now played knight takes f6 check. The king has 2 options, h6 or h8. If the king goes back to h8, you have knight to g6 checkmate. This is like the best checkmate I've ever seen, because it attacks the king, this knight, and then this knight, which is hanging 3 different ways, controls the king's escape squares and suffocates the king. 2 knights suffocate the king. Who said you can't checkmate with 2 knights? Now there you have it. You can checkmate with 2 knights. And not just that. It's a royal and family fork. The king, the rook, and the queen are forked. It's the family fork. What a game. Okay, but now you may say what happens after king h6, right? Now, from this point onwards, every single move is forced. Like black does not have any choice. White plays one move, black has to move to one specific square only. And that is why this game is called Fatal Attraction. The black king is going on a journey to the white army. Knight eg4 check. This knight checks the king. This knight covers this square, and the bishop controls this diagonal. This pawn is obstructing the king from coming back. So that only leaves one square, which is king to g5. And then after this, h4 check. But, okay, I would like to stop here because there is another way to make. No, sorry, not f3. Pawn to f4 check. And now this is technically not forced, but it's still made in 3 because after king takes f4, you have g3 check. Now the king again has 2 options, but both of them lead to mate in 1. King g5 leads to a pawn checkmate with pawn to h4, and that is mate. The pawn checks the king. The knight controls this. This pawn guards the pawn. The knights provide mutual defense. The bishop guards this at this, and this pawn covers this square, and this knight covers this square. And the king is suffocated to death in the middle of the chessboard. And after g3 check, there is one more move, which is king to f3. And this is by far the best checkmate I've ever seen. Castle's checkmate. The rook checks the king. And when the king castled, the king controls g2. What an amazing checkmate, don't you see? And only 33% of castle mates are kingside castle mates. The rook is controlling the file. The knight is defending this. The pawn is guarding this. The king is guarding this. The bishop is guarding this. The knight is guarding this. And the bishop is guarding this. It's checkmate. The king is checkmated in the middle of the chessboard once again in white's territory. Oh my god, Edward Lasker is such a genius. And actually the move f4 is one move faster in the game. But Edward Lasker's pawn to h4 was equally as good. Because it's still made in 3 according to the computer, and it's also made in 3 according to me. The only move is king to f4. And now there are lots of moves to mate here. One of them is 95, but yeah, no one's going to find mate with 95. So, pawn to g3 check. The fastest and easiest way to mate. King to f3. And now here is like a slight inaccuracy from Edward Lasker. He played bishop e2 check. It's excellent because it still forces mate, but it's just like a slight inaccuracy because this move delays the mate by 1 move. And the computer also gives us an excellent because of that. There are 2 moves that leads to checkmate on the next move. One of them is king to f1, which controls the g2 square, and bishop e2 and knight h2 are mate. You can't even stop this. The king is not in check. Up a queen and is getting mated on the next move. You just can't do anything. This is mate. Oh my god. There is actually one more move. Castles. You normally don't see castling be a brilliant move. You usually don't see this. Castling is a brilliant move because the king swings around and guards the g2 square. Most people will say that, well, no, because bishop e2 is not made. Yeah, there is knight h2 mate coming because after rook takes f6, you might say like, okay, the knight doesn't control this. But after knight to h2, the king is mated and the knight controls both f3 and g4. The flight square is disabled for the king, and all of the places, the squares of the king are just covered by pawns, bishop, and knight. Wow. Edward Lasker in the game just wanted to win. So, in order to be safe, he gave checks every single move and played bishop e2 as I mentioned before. And now, This obviously the checkmate he gave is kind of cool. It's much cooler than like castles and then knight h2 mate, or king f1 and then knight h2 mate. So Edward Lasker's opponent played king to g2. All of the pieces are like a machine that bring the king closer. They force the king into white's territory. They're just like guards that push the king into the territory. Push, push, push. It's just like that. And now after king to g2. Rook h2 check. And the king is on the opposite side of the board. You gotta be kidding me. This has never happened in the game. The king started on e8, castled, and then was brought in by a queen sacrifice. And then after this, he was brought in to the other side of the board. And then he went to g5. And then to f4. And then to f3. And then to g2. And then king to g1. That's the only move. And now there's made in a billion ways now. Like, there's made in a billion ways. There's made in 1-2 different ways. And of course, there's lots of other mates. Of course, the coolest move would be long castles mate, where the king finally castles and the rook jumps over the king and delivers it mate. Why this is mate? The knight guards the rook and the pawn. The rook guards the file. And the rook guards this file. But Edward Lasker was kind of a elegant man, and he did not want to disrespect his opponent. So Edward Lasker played king to d2 and checkmated his opponent. And the rook, that was the only piece that was sitting on his home square the whole game, what is the piece that delivers a checkmate. This genius checkmated the king and found a checkmate in 7 moves. Insane. Edward Lasker, probably the best player on the planet, because this is the reason why this game is called Fatal Attraction. And then after this, I did this. It attracts the king closer to the white side. And attracts the king even closer. And then even closer. And then even closer. And then even closer until the king reaches all the way to the end of the board. It cannot escape further. There is no zeroth rank on the chessboard. And after king to d2 is just mate. The king cannot escape. It's the end of the board. And that was an amazing game. Edward Lasker versus Sir George Alan Thomas. Arguably the best game of all time. Even the most brutal king hunt. The most famous king hunt of all time. And I hope you enjoyed this video. Goodbye. I will upload a lot of more videos tomorrow. See you tomorrow, guys. Have a good day and night ahead of you. Good night.